Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Dick Russell, and we're talking about the life and ideas of James Hillman, Volume 2. And Dick has published 15 books, including his last, which is on the Real RFK Jr. He's written 5 books, co-authored 5 books with ex-Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura, and his second volume, or volume 2, of the life and ideas of James Hillman has just been released. It was May 30, I think, Dick, wasn't it?
Yep, just came out. And volume 3 will be coming later this summer.
So welcome. And I wanted to, if I could just ask you before we start, how did you get involved in this mammoth project on James Hillman?
Well, it's an interesting story because, I mean, most of my life I probably would have been the last thing I would have considered, that I would be writing a biography of one of the greatest psychologists of all time. And so let me just backtrack a little bit and talk about my work and kind of what brought me there. I mean, when I was young, I was a Midwestern kid. I grew up, upper middle class family. Basically, I loved sports, and I was a sports writer from when I was very young, and that was my first job. Big job was with Sports Illustrated magazine in New York when I got out of college, in 1969. But by that time, my interest had begun to change from just sports. I was aware suddenly that this was the late 1960s, and there was a Vietnam War, and there were my friends were hippies, and a civil rights movement, and so I was a Kansas kid. I was a Midwesterner who suddenly woke up that there was something else going on in the world. So I didn't last long at Sports Illustrated.
And were you a hippie, Dick?
I wouldn't call myself a hippie, but I was, I was always, I had friends who were, and I remember writing an article called Hippies in Kansas for the Topeka newspaper. So it was like
there was
that.
three of them in the whole of Kansas, is that right?
Right. Actually, there were quite a few more at that point. So I took off anyway with a backpack and a portable typewriter and quit Sports Illustrated. My parents thought I was crazy. My brother thought I was crazy. And I just traveled for a year and a half through Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and hitchhiked all over the place. And while on that trip, fairly early on, I discovered Jung. And I read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I read several of his other books when I was actually in Liverpool, England. And so Jung was someone that really resonated with me. I just, and I found myself in having these experiences that were all about the unconscious. And, I was young and
dreams.
Dreams. I mean, relatively innocent, but so Jung was an early influence. And then when I came back from that trip, and the end of that trip was sort of a very spiritual experience for me. I wasn't conventionally religious, but I guess I'd say I came to believe in the gods and a higher force, in polytheism in those days, because toward the end of the trip, I was in Egypt, and I remember I snuck down one night past the guards, and I slept at the feet of the Sphinx.
Right.
And then I got up in the morning and climbed to the top of the Great Pyramid before anybody could see me. Came back down. That's when they saw me coming back down those big limestone boulders, and somehow, there was no guardrails at that time, but I did it, and when I came back, I felt this mysterious energy. I don't know how to describe it. It was inside the pyramid. I mean, it was this whole thing waking up, I guess, inside me. And Anyway, long story short, I don't want this to be all about me. I came back to the United States, moved to New York, and began freelancing for a wide variety of publications. And I didn't write my first book for a long time, but in the 1970s, I spent several years investigating for the Village Voice and other publications the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And finding out, what really happened behind the curtain, right? And did a lot of articles about that. And that was my first book. And I was thinking about it today because realizing the path, I guess, that led me to James Hillman. My early books were always about what was hidden. They were about mysteries, really. The Kennedy assassination being kind of the biggest mystery of all, right? But
Yeah.
then I wrote a book called Black Genius and the American Experience, which was all about, the genius of African Americans that happened, both ancestrally, and I did comparative chapters on Frederick Douglass and James Baldwin, and looking at for these patterns that emerged in Black culture, and met some amazing people, Gordon Parks and Albert Murray, and I was always drawn when I was young. I traveled all over Africa for quite a while, and then as I grew older, I had a biracial son, and so Africa and those kind of mysteries were always really important to me. Then I wrote a book about whales called Eye of the Whale, about these mysterious friendly gray whales that just come up to people out of nowhere in this lagoon, and you're petting whales in the wild, and nobody knows why they're doing this. Are they sending us some kind of message? And I wrote another book about saving a fish, the Atlantic striped bass, which was this magical creature that I learned how to fish for when I was in my 20s. And so, so all my books
in Jung language, the deep of the unconscious, or the mysteries of the unconscious, in a way, has been a theme.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in the mid 1990s, my friends and I, we shared a life together. We were living together, and we had a place in Mexico, and somebody discovered James Hillman, and we started reading him around the time that he wrote The Soul's Code, which was, as most people probably know, a big bestseller after Oprah had him on, and posited this wonderful idea that about the acorn and the oak, that we choose our parents. Our soul chooses where we're going to be born and to whom, in order to have these experiences when we're children that will open us to our life path, to our destiny, through the daemon, the invisible beings that live with us. So that was a great thing to consider, and we used to talk about it quite a bit. And then one day, one of the young people who'd grown up in my extended family, we were talking about James Hillman in the kitchen, and he said, "Oh, my dad knows James Hillman. He sells him as organic vegetables in the market in Connecticut." So I was in Boston at the time, and
speaking of daemons, maybe that was a fortuitous interruption.
I would say it certainly was, because then I contacted his dad, who I'd known before, and I said, "Wayne, James Hillman, got it. We only live an hour away, or a couple hours away. I'd love to meet him sometime. Could you maybe arrange that?" Well, he said, "Well, he's a very private person. I don't know if that'll work, but it did work." And so my wife and I went to meet with Wayne Hanson, my farmer friend, and James in Connecticut for lunch one day. And we certainly didn't, just talk on about psychology. It turned out that James Hillman, who was 21 years older than I, we had many things in common. We both loved been to Africa when we were young. We loved boxing, and especially Muhammad Ali. And so we just talked about all these fun things that we shared these in common, and that was the beginning, really, of just a friendship. I mean, we then met his wife, Margot McLean, not too long after, and they began visiting us. And they were very interested in how we lived, because we lived communally, in a sense. We'd been sharing a life together for a long time in these different locations, and so in those early years, it was really, just building a friendship over the first 5 years. And then in 2004, I guess, the end of the year, I was up at their place in Connecticut, in Thompson, and his sister was there, his older sister Sue, who was visiting, and she lived in Philadelphia, and she was just such a great storyteller. And I said, James, somebody should set down, be taping her memories while she's still with us. And this gave him the idea to bring together his three siblings and as many of his kids as could come, and have a gathering that summer at their place in Connecticut, where everybody would, where they'd reminisce and tell stories, and have it filmed by a young filmmaker who also was part of my extended family. And so we did that, and I was there. And since I'm an investigative reporter by bent, I ended up asking a lot of the questions,
Right.
and that led to our wives actually sitting down afterwards and just talking about what had happened. And I don't know if I think it was Alice said to Margot, whether James ever going to write his biography or have a biography done, and he had never been interested in that. He didn't. Several people had approached him.
Just one thing, one thing, Dick, is it seems to me that he was always, before you did the biography, he was always very much, about the myth and not wanting to be biographical and all that. So why do you think he changed on that, really?
Well, for one thing, I don't know exactly. I mean, he was getting older, of course, and he'd had a remarkable life.
Yeah.
And I know that he did not want a psychologist per se to write this, because any psychologist naturally would have some kind of preconceived ideas and about who he is and what he's about. And I was coming into it, I guess, from a place of I don't want to say innocence, because I'd read him, I'd read Jung. I wasn't completely ignorant about this, but I came from a different place, and I really wanted to sit down with him and talk and find out about his life, and found that his early years growing up in Atlantic City on the boardwalk, the son of a hotelier, and a rabbi was his grandfather, a famous rabbi on the other side, his mother's side,
and very progressive, reforming.
Yes, Rabbi Krauskopf was his grandfather, very famous and the big reform rabbi of those times before he died in the 1920s.
Yeah,
and so there was a lot to explore there, and also people to interview, and fun people to meet. I mean, Alice and I went to Ireland with he and Margot to visit J.P. Donleavy, the famous novelist, the author of The Ginger Man. And he and James had met when they were in school together at Trinity College in Dublin, and remained lifelong friends. And in fact, when he was young, and up until he discovered, the Jung Institute in Zurich, discovered isn't really quite the word. I can tell that story in a minute, but that he wanted to be a novelist. I mean, that was his. He was definitely wishing to be a novelist. He wanted to be Donleavy, and didn't really. That wasn't really his, his soul's code. But he'd led a fascinating early life, and so we spent a lot of time exploring that. And I interviewed many people, and I originally thought this would just be one volume. I'd write his biography, and that'd be that. But it kept expanding, and I mean, I suppose altogether now I have written close to 2,000 pages about James Hillman that actually appear in print.
Can I just say something about that? I've been writing this essay over the last little while, and it's now at 7 pages, and I've rewritten it about 40 times. And I thought the other day, this can't be happening. Dick Morris has probably written 1,500 pages on James Hillman. And I've been struggling with these 7 pages.
Well, I hope that, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. I do write these long tomes, and maybe it's just I can't contain myself, but I don't know. I mean, studying James Hillman's life,
full of good material, wonderful.
There was so much there, and it was such a learning experience for me, to have a chance to meet his colleagues and these kind of people, and study his work in a way that I certainly can't say I ever mastered, but I knew enough to set down, okay, this is what he did, and how important he is in the history of psychology.
Can I ask you a couple of questions, Dick? Firstly, I love that whole time in Ireland, which was in volume 1, of course, but I don't know, just something really great about that. And I personally, because, kind of the myth of analysis fell out on me at a bookshop when I was a lot younger. I loved reading about the time at Eranos and how those those talks at Aranos, and it ended up becoming the myth of analysis or whatever. But I wondered for you, after all the people you've spoken to, after all that work you've done it on, which period of time do you, I don't know whether to say is your favorite, or do you think is really significant, or, that stays with you?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, because the fascinating thing about him is that he kept he kept changing, but always with sort of a central theme, and the theme was the soul, really. He was not about humanistic psychology or behavioral psychology, and he was going back before Freud and Jung, back to mythology and to the Renaissance figures like Ficino, and bringing these people who had lived before to light, who had been kind of mythical characters, and he was not about the spirit. He recognized spirit, but he was really about soul and soul making.
Yeah.
And how does that happen? And was depression, when it happens to someone, really a bad thing, or does it lead you into a deeper space that where you're able to grow as a human being? And he didn't like that word growth, by the way, but he's so
deepen. Can it help you deepen?
Yeah. And so, his writings, I don't know, depend. I mean, just today, I was, in preparing to speak with you, I was reviewing when he gave the Terry lectures at Yale in 1972, which was his return to America after, the beginning of his return to America after many, many years living in Switzerland. Just the brief background is, for people who don't know, in 1953, which was 20 years before that, he'd enrolled at the Jung Institute during a period of terrible crisis in his life, that also, at the same time, was culminated with his wedding to Kate Kempe, a beautiful Swedish young lady he'd been with for a long time. And so he rose in the ranks. He was studied at the Jung Institute and became director of studies. He knew Jung in the 1950s. They had quite a great relationship, and Jung then appointed him the first director of studies at the Jung Institute in Zurich. So that's still and he had stepped down from that position, or actually been removed from that position during a scandal that I do not gloss over, that I write about, over his relationship with one of his analysans. And but anyway, he then stayed in Zurich and started what became to be known as archetypal psychology. And that was really working with Pat Berry, who was a major figure in the volume 2, his second wife, and originally his student, with whom he began having a relationship when he was still married to Kate. Eventually they got married, but they were working colleagues, and they were really the founders, along with Rafael Lopez-Pedraza, of archetypal psychology.
Who's a bit of a character, isn't he, Raphael?
He was an amazing character. I never had the opportunity to meet him, but he did send me letters. He's no longer alive, but he lived in Venezuela, and he sent me his correspondence with James, which, that's the thing. Just while I'm on that subject, much of the book, or not the whole book, of course, but I had access to so many, hundreds really, of James Hillman's letters, his correspondence with Adolf Guggenbuhl Craig, with Robert Bly, with all these people who had saved his letters. It's a lost art now, because we live in the world of emails, right? But
we save our Zooms now.
That's it, right? Hopefully there was maybe not quite as articulate as we used to set down in prose and letters, but so I based a lot of the book, telling the chronology of his life, on those amazing letter exchanges with people. But he started this, as Rafael Lopez put it. He said, we're going to revive the gods and goddesses and polytheism. Monotheism has failed us. Let's bring these vivid imaginal figures back to life and make them real again. So that's what they set out to do in Zurich. And
He
there's
had a big
one
part
chapter.
in it. Raphael had a
Pardon?
big part with Pat
Oh,
Berry
huge.
and Adolf, but they had a big part in that whole thing, don't they? And maybe some people see it all as Hillman, but it wasn't like it was
Oh
a
no,
real little coterie of people doing that work, wasn't
absolutely it was. And he always loved that. I mean, he spoke quite a bit about collaboration, and he always been collaborating with people
it? Yeah.
his entire career. But yeah, Raphael was a Cuban wild man, kind of looked like reminded people of a bull. I mean, he'd just come right at you, and
Revolutionary.
yes, he'd been a revolutionary. I mean, he was a figure, and
Mm,
very different than James' other friends like Adolf Guggenbuhl Craig,
mm.
with whom James maintained a friendship to the end of his life. He and Raphael eventually, I don't know, for kind of mysterious reasons, didn't end up great friends. But that was a while later. But in those early years, they started a gathering. This was the early '70s, right? So there were all these young people, much like I had been uh, just a couple of years before that, who were searching for something, and they were taking off, and they were traveling, from America and Europe, and they were traveling around the world and having all these experiences and taking drugs and whatever, right? But so many of them ended up in Zurich
Mm,
because they'd heard about this Jung Institute, and
mm.
so they enrolled there, a number of them, and I have a chapter in the biography called a room, let's say, Spring House, or a room full of puers,
Yeah,
Renaissance magic in a room full of
yeah.
puers,
You
and
know, you know what strikes me about it is as I was reading that, and it was interesting, all those, the way they were working together. But it reminded me of what was happening in the wider world, what was happening there. Like
yeah,
you had those daring puers starting spring, which is probably a puer kind of word anyway, I suppose.
yeah, I
But
think so.
it's like and there was an old guard maybe in Zurich, or maybe a little bit of a conservative influence, or since Jung had died, and traditional influence maybe, and then there was kind of these daring young people, which is kind of what was happening in the US and everywhere around the world at this time in a way, wasn't
Absolutely, it was a zeitgeist. It was happening everywhere, and James, in his own way, was very much a part of that with these young people who came over there, and yeah, and his whole idea about Senex and Puer really emerged from the late 1960s, and
it? Yeah.
and that and and what he wrote about in terms of you couldn't have one without the other, really. I mean, you could emphasize the qualities of one more than the other, but really they were inseparable in terms of our makeup. We all have that in us, and we need to, in order to. He had to have Senex qualities, Saturnian discipline,
Yeah.
to do all those footnotes for his books and all the scholarship he did. But at the same time, he always considered himself aware. He was youthful. He was ready for the next challenge, and really is very spirited in that way. I mean, all the way to the end, he was that way. So that's a
He was
puer.
an 80-year-old puer.
He was,
Um,
and I'm that way too. I'm 75 now, and still feel very youthful in many ways. But I got to
but
get to work.
but it's, I don't know. I think if you read about this, you can read it as a psychological idea, Xanax and Poo
Yep.
and that. But it's good to know all the how it was working through life, and sometimes I think it's endlessly fascinating thing for me anyway, thinking about Hillman's makeup, or whatever. But there's that scholar, which was very
Yep.
kind of Xanax, and going back in history and going way back, seems to me. But then
Exactly.
that
No.
kind of, then that freshness of the puer, that kind of.
Yeah, which enabled him to, he and Raphael and Pat at these Springhouse meetings with these young people. I mean, they were they were invoking the memory theater of Don Camillo in the 16th century. They were going back to the Picatrix, this medieval text that was very mystical, I guess is one way to put it. And they
Yeah.
were studying these things that had been forgotten and abandoned, and bringing them right into the present because they resonated, with everybody there. And and at one point there's one story I tell where one night they were talking about Dionysus at one of these gatherings, and suddenly a drunk fell through the window.
Yeah.
Came crashing through the window, and Raphael went, "You see, we constellated." So they brought Dionysus into the.
But that's another thing, you can talk about the Senex and Pur, but it's kind of like sometimes I see that scholar, that Apollo side of Hillman, or whatever. But then I remember reading in your book where he said somewhere that all of his books were about Dionysus, in one way, like it seemed to me he was kind of making that move from the scholar to, more Dionysus.
Yes, I think, and some said he was Hermes. I mean, he embodied different characteristics, right?
Yeah, true.
But yeah, Dionysus was very important to him, and he did several talks about it, wrote essays about this, and one of his friends, I guess, who was it, Spiegelman, told me that he was fascinated in the 50s. He was never a big fan of rock music or he knew who the Beatles were and everything, but it was Elvis Presley who really fascinated him when he came onto the scene as a Dionysian figure, right?
Yeah.
And so, and at the same time, his life in Zurich during that period was tempered, both tempered and he was really on the other side of a lot of the Jungian old guard. He felt that their ideas were stuck basically in a Jungian mold that needed to expand. He had loved Jung and he didn't reject Jung, but he didn't think the concept of the self was really where it was at, that it was all really more about, you had to dive deep and look at how the soul is raising questions that you need to address or take on. And so in that fight, really, against the old guard, one of them in particular, who was sort of Jung's right-hand man for years, C.A. Meyer, turned against him in such a big way after this affair with a student came to light.
And C.A. Meyer, by the way, had his own affairs, which strikes me as a little unusual.
Not only that, but one of those affairs was with Hillman's wife, who was his patient. So
I tell you, it was a rough place right there in the middle of Zurich for a while.
Yeah, so he was always, sort of at war against conventional, I guess you'd say, Jungian dogma, but at the same time trying to expand Jung's thought and Freud's too in new directions, and that's what I try to get across in the book. And he himself was always, I mean, the next period of his life that is fascinating is he comes back to America in 1978. Well, he visits earlier, but moves back in 1978. By this time, he and Pat are married, and they settle in Dallas, of all places. He moves to Texas, and first as a professor at the Dallas Institute, later with the Dallas Institute, at the University of Dallas, which was a very interesting place, a Catholic school though, and very set in its own ways, but with brilliant people like Louise Cowan, who taught English. Just and this again, it's a fascinating crowd that a lot of them very wealthy. He's suddenly lionized by this glamorous Dallas set, right?
Gail
and then
Thomas. Is it Gail Thomas?
Yeah, Gail Thomas, Joanne Stroud.
Yeah.
And so I spend a pretty good amount of time in the book talking about what happened at the university, where he was kicked out again because of his ideas were going too far for this conservative school. And then with Gail Thomas and Joanne,
it's the fate of all puers to have these.
That's it. It's still going on. So he then they start the Dallas Institute of the Humanities, and that's where Hillman gets into what is the soul of the city. Why can't we think about what's going on with how come the architecture is so, I'll forget the word exactly right this minute, but that we need to examine our environment, around our built environment, not just our natural environment, which was already in the consciousness, right? But and so he brought many thinkers there to symposiums in Dallas to talk about how do you envision what tomorrow's city should be like, and befriended these architects, and very pretty amazing. I mean, but when he got into something, he would just dive into it, and he did a whole series, for example, which is more. This is more later in volume 3, but it was called The Architecture of the Imagination, where he worked with a filmmaker to again look at buildings and what they embodied, and in terms of a soul quality that we could take away from. So the Dallas years were very fertile, and they, people like Thomas More, who later became a very well-known thinker in his own right, psychologist and scholar. He met Hillman in Dallas during that period, and then when he moved to Connecticut, he got involved with what's called the Mythopoetic men's movement, and that's a fascinating story too. I think one of the most interesting.
It seems to me after Eranos and the Terry lectures, scholarship, the world of lofty scholars, that it's something that one or two people have mocked Hillman's time in the Mythopoetic men's movement, but I personally feel a lot was going on for him, like coming, the embodying, and Robert Bly's a bit of a genius in his own right, isn't he?
Oh yeah. He and Robert Bly, the poet, and Michael Meade, who was a street kid from New York originally, became a great storyteller, and the three of them were the primary teachers at a series of events that began in the mid-1980s, first in the woods of Minnesota, where Bly lived, and then they took it out to Mendocino, the beautiful redwood forest area of Northern California, and other places all over the country. And yeah, I mean, the movement was, like many movements are, put down by the big media as, oh, this is just a bunch of guys, going off and drumming in the woods and dancing and being stupid and, putting down their wives. And it was so far from that. I mean, that was, to me, one of the most interesting things to write about in the biography, because I interviewed all these guys, who had been part of this, whose lives were transformed and whose wives were transformed by the lives that had transformed in them, because they came back different people.
I agree. It's such an interesting chapter in your book, and another thing that struck me about that was that Hillman might have been used to having psychologists in the audience or whatever, but it was that he had to, like a lot of people were in the Mythopoetic men's movement were Vietnam vets or whatever, or no, and it's kind of like he had to bring it down from. It was a translation, and it was a good translation. He had to bring it down.
He had to be just one of the guys, and and at first it was very difficult for him, and he didn't know how to act, and I think there's the story of the very first one he went to. He put ferns around his midsection and came walking into one of these outdoor gatherings and said, "My name is Fern." I mean, people. You can imagine these guys, right? I mean, who is this highbrow, but they came to, it was a dual thing, they came to deeply appreciate who he was, and because he was such a brilliant thinker, and he came to just connect and make great friends with a lot of these guys, and he was going through a huge transition again in his life at that point, which was similar, if you want to look at it in this, again, what the soul is creating in your life that enables someone like him to see the things that he did and write about them. When he gave the Terry lectures, he was in the process of finally splitting up with Kate, his wife, by whom they had 4 children. And he'd already been together with Pat for a while. But that was a real heart-wrenching time for him. And after he gave those lectures, I have a chapter called Falling Apart, where, his life was just in tatters, right? And then when he entered the men's movement in 1986, he and Pat were on the edge of, splitting up, which happened a couple of years later. So, again, it was like, all right, he was suffering. Part of the men's movement ethos was every childhood gives you a wound, for one thing, but life is all about that. And how do we not overcome really, but how do we embody and deal with the painful things that we go through to become more of who we are. And so that's what I think the men's movement did for him. And and also it awakened him. Well, there was this one incredible event, which I wish I'd been there. It was called Buffalo Gap, and it was in 1993, and it was in the woods of West Virginia, where they brought together 50 black men and 50 white men in the same room, basically, and outdoors, but mostly in a room for 5 days to just talk. And you can imagine it was quite volatile because these men's sessions would really get down to it. What were you feeling, and why do you feel this way? And you had people who'd grown up in terrible racial situations on both sides there, and you had a man who became. I'd like to talk about this a little too later in my own life, but Malidoma Somé, who was a shaman from West Africa originally, from Burkina Faso. He had never spoken before. He was pretty young then, and he'd never addressed a group about his initiation and what had happened to him when he was a child. And briefly, it's a great book he wrote called Of Water and the Spirit. But he was taken from his family in this small village by the Jesuits when he was like 4 years old, and raised by the Jesuits. And finally, at the age of 20, escaped from that rather stultifying atmosphere, made his way back to his village. And when he got there, he didn't speak the language anymore, Dagara. He spoke French, and he was an educated person by the Jesuits. But they took him in. They accepted him so long as he could get through the initiation, which he had to endure. And it was not easy. I mean, it takes you almost to the edge of death. And then he went on to study at the Sorbonne from there and become his name Malidoma means he who becomes friends with or befriends the stranger. Wow. So he was someone who entered white society in that sense, and spoke for the first time at this meeting. And he and James became very, very good friends. And that relationship became very important to me later on, which I can get to that story if you want. When for sure. I spent time with Malidoma.
Absolutely. Why don't we go into that now, Dick? I mean,
well, yeah. It gets to a very important part of my relationship with James because he was never my therapist, and nor do I claim to be an expert on psychology, as I said before. But he was extremely helpful to me because I went through a very painful experience when my son, who was biracial, at the age of 17, had what was called a schizophrenic breakdown. And this went on, with his mother and I not really knowing what to do except put him on more and more medication for a period of time. And there was a period, I guess it was around the time I began the biography, maybe. But I was up visiting James one day to interview him, and he looked at me and he said, "What's something bothering you? Is it your son?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, I'm just having such a hard time as his father, because to me, he was just always in a delusional mode of thinking. He was inventing these imaginary people that he was, and this landscape that he'd known before, and say embarrassing things or at least that embarrassed me. And I didn't know what to do. And I explained this to him, and he said, what you should try to learn to do is just go with him, accept what he says to you. Don't try to fight him, because I used to correct him, and of course that would then embarrass him, and then we'd feel more separated than we had been earlier. And just have fun. Tell him what you're doing, even if he doesn't really care that much. He said nobody treats him like a normal person. Of course, he doesn't like to go in therapy because they think he's crazy, and they're trying to fix him with these medications. And boy, I tell you, once I did that, took that advice, it was the best advice I ever had, because suddenly Franklin and I could connect on a whole, more a real way that wasn't the father who knew what to do and lorded it over him, but we could have fun. I remember once we were in a restaurant in Boston, and there was an Asian place, and he started talking to the waiter in a made up Chinese, and so the waiter didn't know what to make of it. And so as he came around again with our tea or whatever, and Franklin looked at him, and then he looked at me and he says, "Oh," he says, "don't worry." He said, "You're speaking Mandarin, but he only understands Cantonese," something like that, right? So and then we could laugh, and it was just kind of wonderful. So that was the beginning of a change for me that I was going through.
Which in psychological theory as well, going with the symptom. But I mean, like, that's really kind of what it means, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And then James, of course, talked about that a lot in revisioning psychology and the importance of the symptoms and in the therapeutic process. And because he wasn't opposed to therapy. I mean, he wanted to change therapy and eventually to make it, into more of a cultural experience than a personalistic one, because he felt like people had to be more connected to the world and what was going on in it. Yeah. So, and not just talk about their growing up years and their trouble with their wives and all those things. But anyway, so but yeah, and then Malidoma, this there came a time when Franklin was in his 30s, and I was very upset at how deteriorated the medications made him, or how much weight he was putting on, and these kind of things. And so I was looking for something else, some kind of adjunct to therapy. And my wife recalled that, hey, didn't you interview Malidoma for the book on James, which I had just over the phone? And maybe he's somebody that you could go see. And that's what happened. And I ended up writing a whole book about this called My Mysterious Son, A Life-Changing Passage Between Schizophrenia and Shamanism. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but truly, what James's friend, that was another gift to me, a big gift, because I went through a series of divinations with him. He met my son. They hit it off amazingly because, in tribal cultures, often the shaman and the schizophrenic are like, they're considered very similar because they live connected to other worlds. And that's what I learned. That's what I learned from my son. And that's what James's psychology is really about too, is these invisible entities, the imagination bringing to the fore these spirits, really, these divine beings that are with us, that inhabit us.
And in between two worlds sometimes, but having access to that other. Yeah,
and that's, my son lived in both worlds and was much more at home in a world where, he was connecting with invisible entities that I couldn't see, but that doesn't make them not real. And that's what I came to learn from him and from Malidoma.
Did that change your son, that relationship with Malidoma, a lot?
It absolutely did, and changed all of us, because eventually I had taken Franklin to Africa once before, but then in 2016, with my ex, his mother, who were still very close friends, and Franklin, we went with Malidoma to Burkina Faso in West Africa to spend a month with some other people who also came there for a series of healing rituals. And it was life-changing. There was a healer that Malidoma knew, very old man, I mean, close to 100, I think, who would read the pattern of your divination and then prescribe. We had a big pot of African medicine that we bathed with and we drank from each day. And we went through a series of animal rituals where animals were sacrificed for us. I mean, that may be something that people think, oh, that's weird, but and it is. I wouldn't call it. There was something about it that was so incredible, because we had our own bull, and we got to know that animal a little bit, and then that bull was sacrificed for us toward the end of our trip, and the feeling of it was, I can't quite describe it, but it was so real. And it was like the animal was giving its life for us. The animal, by the way, is very important in James Hillman's psychology as well. And I write about that a lot.
Yeah.
Animal dreams and animal, connection and sacrifice, all those things are so again, it was almost, James was gone by then. He died in 2011, but for me, that was still a very important part of my life and my psychology. And after that trip, I came back and Franklin, for a period of time, he went off all of his, he was able, with his doctor's permission, to go off all of his medication. And I've wondered many times, well, what happened to us over there? And I think that part of what happened was just he had his mom and his dad and himself in one place going through this incredible experience together, and sharing it, and we'd never done anything like that before. And I think that was very important too. And now he's living with his mom in Baltimore and doing some amazing art. He's a fine artist and does these unusual sculptures made out of all these, out of wood and metal and parts. So he's doing better than he's been, since he had that breakdown and when he was 17. So he's still on some medication. I'm not saying we threw it all away. But at the same time, it's, he's these other avenues that, thank God, we're able to explore, have really helped our relationship and certainly helped him, as he's in his 40s now.
And there's something about, I don't know, sometimes the dark side of psychology, maybe, to label someone,
Yeah.
bipolar, or to label and then medicate. But then it's kind of what Hillman was getting at in a way too, of what is it? Psychology is mythology. And
yeah, exactly.
It's kind of embracing this other aspect or whatever.
It absolutely is. And I think, as I was rereading his talks at the Terry lectures on personifying and on psychologizing and where these talks, by the way, were so incredible to imagine. Ed Casey, who was there as a student, recalls that at the end of each lecture, which were packed, I mean, hundreds of students in these auditoriums at Yale, and he would end up exhausted, and he would lie down on his back on the floor with a microphone and saying, "Anybody wants to ask me a question, come up here, because I've had it." And then he'd give these, and Casey remembers this incredibly eloquent, response that he'd give lying on his back after one of these lectures. So, but it's amazing.
Dick, one other thing I got from your books is, the biography is, I've often seen Hillman as, I see him as brave, how he's, come out with ideas and taken on the old guard and all of that. And I think he's very brave the way he did that, and the poor kind of grandeur or whatever, but quite a bit of melancholy, like in a lot of letters to his friends. I think it's Ed Stein, is it, or whatever?
Robert Stein. Yeah.
Robert Stein. A lot of thoughts of whether he was on the right track or was he doing it right or being, that's one thing that really has come true for me. Like he wasn't kind of all up there.
Yeah, absolutely. And which reminds me, there was a couple of brief passages I wanted to share with you that he and your listeners about, it kind of shows who he was in terms of his relationship with women and with Pat and with Kate. This was one he wrote to Pat in I don't know, let's see, when he was in the chapter called Falling Apart. And he said, "You are the image of my erotic inhibitions. I am unable to give for society and sanctification of the world of right, would R-I-T-E, would have me give, because I feel a betrayal towards you, and with you cannot let myself flee into fun because I feel a betrayal of the status of the upright man, bound. So I use you two women images to inhibit myself from full participation in either direction. Is this psychic laming? Is this to keep from developing split feeling and so on? It troubles me immediately that I cannot be wholeheartedly with either you or Kate. Much depression here. Isn't that an amazing expression? And then he writes to Kate later during this same period, right before he moves out. Amazing letter. He just didn't know where to go with his marriage, right? And he writes her, Bird, look, we bear each other real goodwill and real love and get so wasted in this struggle. I know you need closeness to me and also independence from my domination. But when we try to get each other to connect through the weak side, it's useless. I can't connect through the feeling side to you directly. The relationship as such, the sex, eros, etc., are not where I'm at with you. I would want you to react to my work with ideas and feelings, get interested and excited in it with me, carry it on in your mind further as a living relationship, for that's where I am at. Okay, probably that's too much demand on you, on top of everything else you have. But that's the kernel of the issue. What you want, I am not there, and what I want, you are not there. But it doesn't matter really, or does it, if we don't press in these two opposite directions? If we stop the demand on each other, let's see what happens, where the libido goes, where the relationship goes. Whatever, do not blame yourself that something is wrong with you in your needs and wishes, or your sensation that I am not in the relationship with you. Your perceptions are right. But I don't blame myself either, or get guilty and then hateful, and try to force myself to feel what I don't feel. I've spent too many years trying Jungian methods of correcting myself from above with my mind. It's useless and makes me hateful. Don't you do it either to yourself. You're great as you are.
Yeah.
So that gives a bit of a picture of, don't you think?
It does, yeah. Yeah. You know, the ongoing through his life, maybe, too, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I would say so. He was always soul searching, literally. And, working to admit his mistakes, his human failings, and yet, moving ahead to where he felt like he needed to go. And it was such a privilege to know him. He was one of the great men I've ever known. And as I said, not someone that I expected to become his authorized biographer. And I hope I've done him justice. It was not an easy road. I mean, I worked on these books it's a trilogy now, and it's been almost 20 years. He told now I didn't do that all the time. I've written a number of other books at the same time, which he wanted me to do. And but I remember at the beginning he says, "This will take years, And then I remember he also said, "Welcome, traveler."
It reminds me of, I don't know how accurate this is, but James Joyce sat down to write an essay and 10 years later came out with a book or something. He couldn't ever let go of that essay. But there's something like, when you take on something, how that can grow and become such a big thing. But it's wonderful, your biographies, and or your biography on him in particular I'm talking about. But, I've taken a lot from it. And I'm sure I know a lot of people have been saying, when's volume 2 coming out? And
it kept being delayed and delayed.
But because you've spoken to so many people as well and all of that, there's a cast of many interesting characters as well.
Yeah, there really are people like Bly and Mead and Malidoma and Dunleavy and then the poets that he knew. There was toward the end of the book I read a chapter called A Poetic Basis of Mind, where get into other, because poets loved him. Creative writers loved his psychology, where he took things, the mythos that he embodied and spoke of. So he was friends with people like Robert Duncan and got to know Creeley, and he was always, but he had friends from all walks of life. I mean, he'd grown up, in Atlantic City, spending a lot of time down in the basement with with the guys who worked in the hotel and watching how they did things, you know, and how they put this together. That was sort of the inner world that he had in part. And then, you know, he'd go out on the boardwalk and there was the high diving horse and the, you know, these amazing fantasy figures that he grew up observing and later, you know, incorporating into, in a sense, into his psychology. So
I was thinking when I was reading it, a great intellect, but not an intellectual snob, maybe. And maybe that's one of the very endearing things about Hillman, that, okay, we know he has his peculiarities and faults, perhaps, like everyone, but not that snob, you know, not the scholarly snob. Although in some ways, you know, you could say was very precise.
Well, he was certainly erudite, but at the same time, he told me once that he never felt like he quite measured up to some of these great minds that he was with. He said once somebody set him up for dinner. I forget, it was Verneau and somebody who I'm not familiar with, but this incredible dinner that he was supposed to have, where these titans of the intellect were going to solve the problems of the world or have an incredible conversation. He said when the dinner ended, he walked away from it and he couldn't remember a damn thing. and he said that he was, oh my God. I mean, I've been in that kind of place myself sometimes, but you know, he just felt like these men had something that he could only, you know, he couldn't measure up to. Interesting, because you know, his mother was very much he was the golden boy as a child, and so she was always, you know, lauding him as the great mind, but he also was he rebelled against her for much of his life. So anyway, it's just been it's been a journey writing this book and traveling as he's predicted I would, through some tough stuff and some wonderful things too that I never would have expected. So,
and some good friendships, I would imagine, along the way.
Oh, absolutely. Became close to a number of his friends, you know, and still am.
And Dick, you know, your book on the real JFK Jr. just come out.
Yep.
So what's happening now? How many more books have you got in you? Another 20 or 30 or what?
Oh, that'd be nice. No, I think I'm in the home stretch here, but this year actually, it's sort of coincidental because, you know, the Hillman books I've obviously been working on for years, and they're now volume 2 and 3 are coming out. It's pretty much the same time, and then there'll be a box set, I think, at the end of the year of all three. But the book I started working on a year ago, The Real RFK Jr., is about Robert Kennedy Jr., who is now, as many people know, running for president of the United States. That was not happening when I started writing the biography, but he's again, he's a longtime friend, someone that I've known in the environmental world, and we've, you know, worked on projects together around the environment, around whales and fish, and as I mentioned earlier, and I just began to think that there needed to be a real book written about him because he was being so maligned in the mainstream media for his controversial views on public health and being labeled an anti-vaxxer, which he's really not. But you know, people were misconstruing who he was, and I thought something should be written that gets across his environmental record as the greatest environmental activist lawyer in the United States for 40 years, and just also what a courageous guy he is, and how he could make a big difference in this country. So that's my other project, and I'm doing all these podcasts right now talking about that book, and so I hope I've been coherent enough in talking with you about James.
It's been great. Thanks very much, and thank you for fitting me in with all those. You've been swinging between Hillman and RFK Jr. So thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Oh, I really enjoyed talking with you too. Thanks for having me.